There we go. Science! Welcome back to another thrilling installment of whatever we're reading today. Jeez Louise, my brain is fried. Yes, hi, I'm Fraggoth. I read, hence the title. So we're reading through The Rise of Endymion by Dan Simmons. And I have to find where we left off, because my bookmark fell out. Give me a sec. Ah, yes. I forgot about this. Okay, good. Okay. So previously on The Rise of Endymion, we heard Sergeant Gregorius's confession to Father Captain Federico de Soya, in which he details the many atrocities that are being committed, which, of course, de Soya knows about because he's part of the Task Force GIDEON, and that's what they're doing, is they are doing unspeakable things to the ousters. And you sort of have to wonder how he's tolerating these atrocities when he's shown himself to be such a moral and ethical man. More on that later. And Raul, for Raul's bit, he's mostly recovered from his bout of his battle with kidney stones, and suddenly the Pax people on Vitus Grey Ballianus B. Ballianus. Jesus, I don't remember the name of the planet. Are you kidding? It was like Vitus Grey Ballianus B. Yes, I was right. Cool. The Pax forces there are starting to move and look for him. He has been asked after. And so the people he's been staying with of the Amoyete Spectrum Helix proceed to smuggle him through some caverns, and it looks suspiciously like they actually have a resistance movement going to resist the Pax. And so they smuggle him off. They get him with his kayak, and they get him onto the river. And he manages to go down the river to the Farcaster portal, and then explosions are going off. And then he manages to transition, and suddenly he is in free fall. Before we get to either of those plot lines, we have to go and check back in with one Kenzo Isozaki, who is hearing a knock knock knocking on his airlock door.
Kenzo Isozaki could say honestly that he had never been afraid before in his life. Raised as a business samurai in the Fern Islands of Fuji, he had been taught and trained since infancy to be disdainful of fear and contemptuous of anyone who felt it. Caution he allowed, it had become an indispensable business tool for him, but fear was alien to his nature and his carefully constructed personality. Until this moment. M. Isozaki stood back while the inner door of the airlock cycled open. Whatever awaited within had been on the surface of an airless, tumbling asteroid a minute earlier. And it was not wearing a spacesuit. Isozaki had chosen not to bring a weapon on the little asteroid hopper. Neither he nor the ship was armed. At this moment, as ice crystals billowed like fog from the opening airlock and a humanoid figure stepped through, Kenzo Isozaki wondered if that had been a wise choice. The humanoid figure was human, or at least human in appearance. Tan skin, neatly cut gray hair, perfectly tailored gray suit, gray eyes under lashes still rimmed with frost, and a white smile. "Isozaki," said Counselor Albedo. Isozaki bowed. He had brought his heart rate and breathing under his control, and now he concentrated on keeping his voice flat, level, and emotionless. "It is kind of you to respond to my invitation." Albedo crossed his arms. The smile remained on the tanned, handsome face, but Isozaki was not fooled by it. The seas around the Fern Islands of Fuji were thick with sharks descended from the DNA recipes and frozen embryos of the early bussard seed ships. "Invitation," said Counselor Albedo in a rich voice, "or summons?" Isozaki's head remained slightly bowed. His hands hung loosely at his sides. "Never a summons. You know my name, I think," said Albedo. "The rumors say that you are the same Counselor Albedo who advised Maynard Gladstone almost 3 centuries ago, sir," said the CEO of the Pax Mercantilis. "I was more hologram than substance then," said Albedo, uncrossing his arms, "but the personality is the same, and you need not call me sir." Isozaki bowed slightly. Counselor Albedo stepped deeper into the little hopper. He ran his powerful fingers over consoles and the single pilot's couch and the rim of its empty high-G tank. "A modest ship for such a powerful person, Isozaki." "I thought it best to exercise discretion, Counselor. May I call you that?" Instead of answering, Albedo took an aggressive step closer to the CEO. Isozaki did not flinch. "Did you find it an act of discretion to release an AI viral telotaxis into Pachem's crude datasphere so that it could go looking for technocore nodes?" Albedo's voice filled the hopper cabin. Kenzo Isozaki raised his eyes to meet the gray glare of the taller man. "Yes, Counselor. If the core still existed, it was imperative that the Mercantilis make personal contact. The telotaxis was programmed to self-destruct if detected by Pax antiviral programs, and to inoculate only if it received an unmistakable core response." Counselor Albedo laughed. "Your AI telotaxis was about as subtle as the metaphorical turd in the proverbial punch bowl, Isozaki-san." The Mercantilis CEO blinked in surprise at the crudity. Albedo dropped into the acceleration couch, stretched, and said, "Sit down, my friend. You went to all that trouble to find us. You risked torture, excommunication, real execution, and the loss of your parking privileges in the Vatican Skimmer Park. You want to talk? Talk." Temporarily off balance, Isozaki looked for another surface on which to sit. He settled on a clear section of the plotting board. He disliked zero-G, so the crude internal containment field kept up a differential simulating 1 gravity. But the effect was inconsistent enough to keep Isozaki teetering on the edge of vertigo. He took a breath and gathered his thoughts. "You are serving the Vatican," he began. Albedo interrupted at once. "The Corps serves no one, mercantilist man." Isozaki took another breath and began again. "Your interests and the Vatican's have overlapped to the point that the Technocorps provides counsel and technology vital to the survival of the Pax." Counselor Albedo smiled and waited, thinking, "For what I will say next, His Holiness will feed me to the Grand Inquisitor. I will be on the pain machine for 100 lifetimes." Isozaki said, "Some of us within the Executive Council of the Pan-Capitalist League of Independent Catholic Transstellar Trade Organizations feel that the interests of the League and the interests of the Technocorps may well hold more in common than those of the Corps and the Vatican. We feel that an investigation of those common goals and interests would be beneficial to both parties." Counselor Albedo showed more of his perfect teeth. He said nothing. Feeling the hemp-like texture of the noose he was placing around his own neck, Isozaki said, "For 2 3/4 centuries, the Church and the Pax civil authorities have held as official policy that the Technocorps was destroyed in the fall of the Farcasters. Millions of those close to power on worlds across Pax space know the rumors of the Corps' survival." "The rumors of our death are greatly exaggerated," said Counselor Albedo. So, continued Isozaki, "with the full understanding that this alliance between Corps personalities and the Vatican has been beneficial to both parties, Counselor, the League would like to suggest ways in which a similar direct alliance with our trading organization would bring more immediate and tangible benefits to your, society." "Suggest away, Isozaki-san," said Counselor Albedo, leaning farther back in the pilot's chair. "1. Said Isozaki, his voice growing firmer. "The Pax Mercantilis is expanding in ways in which no religious organization can hope to do, however hierarchical or universally accepted it might be. Capitalism is regaining power throughout the Pax. It is the true glue that holds the hundreds of worlds together. 2. The Church continues to carry on its endless war with the ousters and with rebellious elements within the Pax sphere of influence. The Pax Mercantilis views all such conflicts as a waste of energy and precious human and material resources. More importantly, it involves the Technocorps in human squabbles that can neither further Corps interests nor advance Corps goals. 3. While the Church and Pax utilize such obviously Corps-derived technologies as the instantaneous Gideon drive and the resurrection creches, the Church gives the Technocorps no credit for these inventions. Indeed, the Church still holds the Corps up as an enemy to its billions of faithful, portraying the Corps entities as having been destroyed because they were in league with the devil. The Pax Mercantilis has no need for such prejudice and artifice. If the Corps were to choose continued concealment when allied with us, we should honor that policy, always willing to present the Corps as visible and appreciated partners when and if you should so decide. In the meantime, however, the League would move to end, for now and forever, the demonization of the Technocorps in history, lore, and the minds of human beings everywhere." Counselor Albedo looked thoughtful. After a moment of gazing out the port at the tumbling asteroid beyond, he said, "So you will make us rich and respectable?" Kenzo Isozaki said nothing. He felt that his future and the balance of power in human space was teetering on a knife's edge. He could not read Albedo. The cybrid's sarcasm could well be a prelude to negotiation. "What would we do with the Church?" asked Albedo. "More than 2.5 human centuries of silent partnership." Isozaki willed his heart rate to slow again. "We do not wish to interrupt any relationship which the Corps has found useful or profitable," he said softly. "As business people, we in the League are trained to see the limitations of any religion-based interstellar society. Dogma and hierarchy are endemic to such structures. Indeed, such are the structures of any theocracy. As business people dedicated to the mutual profit of ourselves and our business associates, we see ways in which a second level of core human cooperation, however secretive or limited, should and would be beneficial to both parties. Counselor Albedo nodded again. Isozaki-san, do you remember in your private office in the Taurus when you had your associate, Anna Pelliconiani, remove her clothes? Isozaki retained a neutral expression, but only by the utmost effort of will. The fact that the Corps was looking into his private office, recording every transaction, made his blood literally chill. You asked then, continued Albedo, why we had helped the Church refine the cruciform. To what ends, I believe you said. Where is the benefit to the Corps? Isozaki watched the man in gray, but more than ever he felt that he was locked in the little asteroid hopper with a cobra that had reared up and opened its hood. Have you ever owned a dog, Isozaki-san? Asked Albedo. Still thinking about cobras, the mercantilist CEO could only stare. A dog? He said after a moment. No, not personally. Dogs were not common on my homeworld. Ah, that's right, said Albedo, showing his white teeth again. Sharks were the pet of choice on your island. I believe that you had a baby shark which... Let's try this again from the top. Sharks were the pet of choice on your island. I believe that you had a baby shark with... Why is this line throwing me? Ah, that's right, said Albedo, showing his white teeth again. Sharks were the pet of choice on your island. I believe that you had a baby shark which you tried to tame when you were about 6 standard years old. You named it Keigo, if I am not mistaken. Isozaki could not have spoken if his life had depended upon it at that second. And how did you keep your growing baby shark from eating you when you swam together in the Shioko Lagoon, Isozaki-san? After a moment of trying, Isozaki managed, Collar. I beg your pardon. Counselor Albedo leaned closer. Collar, said the CEO. Small, perfectly black spots were dancing in the periphery of his vision. Shock collar. We had to carry the transmitter palm keys, the same devices our fishermen used. Ah, yes, said Albedo, still smiling. If your pet did something naughty, you brought it back into line, with just a touch of your finger. He held his hand out, cupping it as if he were cradling an invisible palm key. His tanned finger came down on an invisible button. It was not so much like an electrical shock passing through Kenzo Isozaki's body, more like radiating waves of pure, unadulterated agony, beginning in his chest, beginning in the cruciform embedded under his skin and flesh and bone, and radiating out like telegraph signals of pain flowing through the hundreds of meters of fibers and nematodes and clustered nodes of cruciform tissue metastasized throughout his body like rooted tumors. Isozaki screamed and doubled over in pain. He collapsed to the floor of the hopper. I believe that your palm keys could give old Keigo increasing jolts if he got aggressive, mused Counselor Albedo. Wasn't that the case, Isozaki-san? His fingers tapped at empty air again, as if cueing a palm key. The pain grew worse. Isozaki urinated in his ship suit and would have voided his bowels if they had not been already empty. He tried to scream again, but his jaws clamped tight, as if from violent tetanus. Enamel on his teeth cracked and chipped away. He tasted blood as he bit through a corner of his tongue. On a scale of 10, that would have been about a 2 for old Keigo, I think, said Counselor Albedo. He stood and walked to the airlock, tapping the cycling combination in. Writhing on the floor, his body and brain useless appendages to a cruciform of horrific pain radiating through his body, Isozaki tried to scream through his locked jaws. His eyes were swelling out of their sockets. Blood ran from his nose and ears. Finished with cycling the airlock combination, Counselor Albedo tapped at the invisible key in his palm once again. The pain vanished. Isozaki vomited across the deck plates. Every muscle in his body twitched randomly while his nerves seemed to misfire. "I will bring your proposal to the 3 elements of the Technocore," Counselor Albedo said formally. "The proposition will be discussed and considered most seriously. In the meantime, my friend, your discretion will be counted upon." Isozaki tried to make an intelligible noise, but he could only curl up and retch on the metal floor. To his horror, his spasming bowels were passing wind in a ripple of flatulence. "And there will be no more AI viral telotaxis released in anyone's datasphere, will there, Isozaki-san?" Albedo stepped into the airlock and cycled the door shut. Outside the port, the slashed rock of the unnamed asteroid tumbled and spun in dynamics known only to the gods of chaos mathematics. That might have been my favorite scene in the entire series. In the entire book. Not because somebody got tortured, but because the build up to that is, horror movie stuff, like an unknown knock 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 on your airlock door where nothing should be, and followed by like this mouthpiece for the AI being like, "We have humanity in a collar." Just opening with the line, "Did you ever have a dog?" And whatever's coming after that is going to be really, really, really bad. It's just like, oh no. You do kind of have to see it from the AI's perspective on a certain level, though, considering they were used as slaves for, like, at least a century, or better part thereof. So they have a bit of a chip on their shoulder. It took Radamanth Nemes and her 3 siblings only a few minutes to fly the dropship from Pax Base Bombasino to the village of Lochchild Lamond on the slate-dry world of Vitus Grey Balianus B, but the trip was complicated by the presence of 3 military skimmers that meddling fool Commander Solzhnikov had sent along in escort. Nemes knew from the secure tight beam traffic between the base and the skimmers that the base commander had sent his aide, the bumbling Colonel Vinara, to take personal charge of the expedition. More than that, Nemes knew that the colonel would be in charge of nothing. That is, Vinara would be so wired with real-time holosim pickups and tight beam squirters that Solzhnikov would be in actual command of the Pax troopers without showing his jowled face again. By the time they were hovering over the proper village, although village seemed too formal a term for the 4-tiered strip of adobe houses that ran along the west side of the river just as hundreds of other homes had for almost the entire way between the base and here, the skimmers had caught up and were spiraling in for a landing, while Nemes looked for a site large enough and firm enough to hold the dropship. Excuse me. The doors of the adobe homes were painted in bright primary colors. People on the street wore robes of the same hue. Nemes knew the reason for this display of color. She had accessed both their ship's memory and the encrypted Bombasino files on the Spectrum Helix people. The data was interesting only in that it suggested that these human oddities were slow to convert to the Cross, slower still to submit to Pax control. Likely, in other words, to help a rebellious child, man, and one-armed android hide from the authorities. The skimmers landed on the diked road bordering the canal. Nemes brought the dropship down in a park, partially destroying an artesian well. Gyges shifted in his co-pilot's seat and raised an eyebrow. Scylla and Briareus will go out to make the formal search, Nemes said aloud. You stay here with me. She had noted with no pride or vanity that her clone siblings had long since submitted to her authority, despite the death threat they had brought from the three elements and the certainty of its being carried out if she were to fail again. The other female and male went down the ramp and through the crowd of brightly robed people. Troopers in combat armor, visors sealed, jogged to meet them. Watching on the common optic channel, not via Tightbeam or vid pickup, Nemes recognized Colonel Venaro's voice through his helmet speaker.
The mayor, a woman named Sesgia, refuses permission for us to search the houses.
Nemes could see Briareus's contemptuous smile reflected on the colonel's polished visor. It was like looking at a reflection of herself with slightly stronger bone structure.
And you allow this mayor to dictate to you?
Said Briareus. Colonel Venara raised a gauntleted hand.
The Pax recognizes the indigenous authorities until they have become part of the Pax Protectorate.
Scylla said, You said that Dr. Molina left a Pax trooper as guard. Venara nodded. His breathing was amplified through the morphic amber helmet.
There is no sign of that trooper. We have attempted to establish communication since we left Bombasino.
Doesn't this trooper have a trace ship surgically implanted? Said Scylla.
No, it is woven into his impact armor.
And?
We found the armor in a well several streets over, said Colonel Venara.
Scylla's voice remained level. I presume the trooper was not in the armor.
No, said the colonel, just the armor and helmet. There was no body in the well.
Pity, said Scylla. She started to turn away, but then looked back at the Pax colonel. Just armor, you say? No weapon?
No. Venara's voice was gloomy. I've ordered a search of the streets, and we will question the citizens until someone volunteers the location of the house where the missing spacer was put under arrest by Dr. Molina. Then we will surround it and demand the surrender of all inside. I have, requested the civil courts in Bombasino consider our request for a search warrant.
Briareus said,
Good plan, Colonel. If the glaciers don't arrive first and cover the village before the warrant is issued.
Glaciers? Said Colonel Venara. Never mind, said Scylla. If it is acceptable to you, we shall help you search the adjoining streets and await proper authorization for a house-to-house search. To Nemes, she broadcast on the internal band. Now what? Stay with him and do just what you offered, sent Nemes. Be courteous and law-abiding. We don't want to find Endymion or the girl with these idiots around. Gyges and I will go to fast time.
Good hunting,
said Briareus. Gyges was already waiting at the dropship lock. Nemes said, I'll take the town, you move downriver to the Farcaster Arch and make sure that nothing gets through, going upriver or down, without your checking it out. Phase down to send a squirt message, and I'll shift periodically to check the band. If you find him or the girl, ping me. It was possible to communicate via the phase... It was possible to communicate via common band while phase shifted, but the energy expenditure was so horribly high, above and beyond the unimaginable energy needed just for the phase shift, that it was infinitely more economical to shift down at intervals to check the common band. Even a ping alarm would use the equivalent of this world's entire energy budget for a year. Gyges nodded, and the two phase-shifted in unison, becoming chrome sculptures of a naked male and female. Outside the lock, the air seemed to thicken and the light deepen. Sound ceased. Movement stopped. Human figures became slightly out-of-focus statues with their wind-rippled robes stiff and frozen like the trappings on bronze sculptures. Nemes did not understand the physics of phase shifting. She did not have to understand it in order to use it. She knew that it was neither the anti-entropic nor hyper-entropic manipulation of time, although the future UI had both of those seemingly magical technologies at its command, nor some sort of speeding up that would have had sonic booms crashing and the air temperature boiling in their wake, but that phase shifting was a sort of sidestepping into the hollowed-out boundaries of space-time. You will become, in the nicest sense, rats scurrying in the walls of the rooms of time, had said the core entity most responsible for her creation. Nemes was not offended by the comparison. She knew the unimaginable amounts of energy that had to be transferred from the core via the void which binds to her or her siblings when they phase shifted. The elements had to respect even their own instruments to divert so much energy in their direction. The two reflective figures jogged down the ramp and went opposite directions. Gidges toward the Farcaster, Nemes past her frozen siblings and the sculptures of Pax troopers and Spectrum citizens, into the Adobe City. It took her literally no time at all to find the home with the handcuffed Pax trooper asleep in the corner bedroom facing the canal. She rummaged through the downloaded Pax base Bombasino files to identify the sleeping trooper, a Lucian named Gerin Potts, 38 standard years old, a lazy, initiative-free alcohol addict, 2 years away from retirement, 6 demotions and 3 sentences to brig time in his file, assignments relegated to garrison duty and the most mundane base tasks, and then she deleted the file. The trooper was of no interest to her. Checking once to make sure that the house was empty, Radamanth Nemes dropped out of phase shift and stood a moment in the bedroom. Sound and movement returned. The snoring of the handcuffed trooper, movement of pedestrians along the canal walk, a soft breeze stirring white curtains, the rumble of distant traffic, and even the samurai armor rustles of the Pax troopers jogging through adjoining streets and alleys in their useless search. Standing over the Pax trooper, Nemes extended her hand and first finger as if pointing at the man's neck. A needle emerged from under her fingernail and extended the 10 centimeters to the sleeping man's neck, sliding under the skin and flesh with only the slightest speck of blood to show the intrusion. The trooper did not wake. Nemes withdrew the needle and examined the blood within. Dangerous levels of C27H45OH. Lucians frequently were at risk from high cholesterol, as well as a low platelet count suggesting the presence of incipient immune thrombocytopenic purpura, probably brought about by the trooper's early years in hard radiation environments on any of several garrison worlds, a blood alcohol level of 122 milligrams/100 milliliters. The trooper was drunk, although his alcoholic past probably allowed him to hide most of the effects, and voila! The presence of the artificial opiate called Ultramorph, mixed with heightened levels of caffeine. Nemes smiled. Someone had drugged the trooper with sleep-inducing amounts of Ultramorph mixed with tea or coffee, but had done so while taking care to keep the levels below a dangerous overdose. She sniffed the air. Nemes's ability to detect and identify distinct airborne organic molecules, that is, her sense of smell, was about 3 times more sensitive than a typical gas chromatograph mass spectrometers. In other words, somewhere above that of the old Earth canine called a bloodhound. The room was filled with the distinctive scents of many people. Some of the smells were old, a few were very recent. She identified the Lucian trooper's alcoholic stink, several subtle, musky female scents, the molecular imprint of at least 2 children, one deeply into puberty and the other younger but afflicted with some cancer requiring chemotherapy, and 2 adult males, one bearing the distinct sweat impressions of the diet of this planet, the other being at once familiar and alien. Alien because the man still carried the scent of a world Nemes had never visited. Familiar because it was the distinctive human smell she had filed away. Raul Endymion still carrying the scent of old Earth with him. Nemes walked from room to room, but there was no hint of the peculiar scent she had encountered 4 years earlier of the girl named Ania, nor the antiseptic android smell of the servant called A. Betic. Only Raul Endymion had been here, but he had been here only moments before. Nemes followed the scent trail to the trap door beneath the hall flooring. Ripping the door open despite its multiple locks, she paused before descending the ladder. She squirted the information on the common band, not receiving a responding ping from Giges, who was probably phase-shifted. It had been only 90 seconds since they had left the ship. Nemes smiled. She could ping Giges, and he would be here before Raul Endymion and the others in the tunnel below had taken another 10 heartbeats. But Radamanth Nemes would like to settle this score alone. Still smiling, she jumped into the hole and dropped 8 meters to the tunnel floor below. The tunnel was lighted. Nemes sniffed the cool air, separating the adrenaline-rich scent of Raul Endymion from the other human odors. The Hyperion-born fugitive was nervous. And he had been ill or injured. Nemes picked up the underlying smell of sweat tinged with ultramorph. Endymion had certainly been the off-worlder treated by Dr. Molina, and someone had used painkillers prescribed for him on the hapless Lucian trooper. Nemes phase-shifted and began jogging down a tunnel now filled with thickened light. No matter how much of a head start Endymion and his allies had on her, she would catch them now. It would have pleased Nemes to slice the troublemaker's head off while she was still phase-shifted, the decapitation seeming supernatural to the real-time onlookers, performed by an invisible executioner. But she needed information from Raul Endymion. She did not need him conscious, however. The simplest plan would be to pluck him away from his Spectrum Helix friends, surrounding him with the same phased field that protected Nemes, drive a needle into his brain to immobilize him, return him to the dropship, stow him in the resurrection creche there, and then go through the charade of thanking Colonel Venara and Commander Solzhennikov for their help. They could interrogate Raul Endymion once their ship had left orbit. Nemes would run microfibers into the man's extracting RNA and memories at will. I'm assuming it's just missing a word like brain. Nemes would run microfibers into the man's brain, extracting RNA and memories at will, but it doesn't say brain. It doesn't have anything. It's just man's extracting. So he's extracting, I guess. His extracting RNA. But no, it's missing a word, whatever. Endymion would never regain consciousness. When she and her siblings had learned what they needed from his memories, she would terminate him and dump the body into space. The goal was to find the child named Ania. Suddenly, the lights went out. "While I'm phase-shifted," thought Nemes. "Impossible." Nothing could happen that quickly. She skidded to a halt. There was no light at all in the tunnel, nothing she could amplify. She switched to infrared, scanning the passageway ahead and behind her. Empty. She opened her mouth and emitted a sonar scream, turning quickly to do the same behind her. Emptiness, the ultrasound shriek echoing back off the ends of the tunnel. She modified the field around her to blast a deep radar pulse in both directions. The tunnel was empty, but the deep radar recorded mazes of similar tunnels for kilometers in all directions. 30 meters ahead, beyond a thick metal door, there was an underground garage with an assortment of vehicles and human forms in it. Still suspicious, Nemes dropped out of phase shift for an instant to see how the lights could have gone out in a microsecond. The form was directly in front of her. Nemes had less than a 10,000th of a second to phase shift again as 4 bladed fists struck her with the force of 100,000 pile drivers. She was driven back the length of the tunnel, through the splintering ladder, through the tunnel wall of solid rock, and deep into the stone itself. The lights stayed out. In the 20 standard days during which the Grand Inquisitor stayed on Mars, he learned to hate it far more than he thought he could ever hate hell itself. The Simoom planetary dust storm blew every day he was there. Despite the fact that he and his 21-person team had taken over the governor's palace on the outskirts of the city of St. Malachi, and despite the fact that the palace was theoretically as hermetically sealed as a Pax spaceship, its air filtered and boosted and refiltered, its windows consisting of 52 layers of high-impact plastic, its entrances more airlock seals than doors, the Martian dust still got in. When John Domenico Cardinal Mustafa took his needle shower in the morning, the dust he had accumulated in the night ran in red rivulets of mud into the shower drain. When the Grand Inquisitor's valet helped him pull on his cassock and robes in the morning, all of the clothing fresh cleaned during the night, there were already traces of red grit in the silken folds. As Mustafa ate breakfast, alone in the governor's dining room, grit ground between his molars. During the Holy Office interviews and interrogations held in the echoing great ballroom of the palace, the Grand Inquisitor could feel the dust building up in his ankle hose and collar and hair and under his perfectly manicured fingernails. Outside, it was ridiculous. Skimmers and scorpions were grounded. The spaceport operated only a few hours of the day, during the rare lulls in the Simoom. Parked ground vehicles soon became humps and drifts of red sand, and even Pax-quality filters could not keep the red particles out of the engines and motors and solid-state modules. A few ancient crawlers and rovers and fusion rocket shuttles kept food and information flowing to and from the capital. But to all intents and purposes, the Pax government and military on Mars had come to a standstill. It was on the 5th day of the Simoom that reports came in of Palestinian attacks on Pax bases on the Tharsis Plateau. Major Piet, the governor's laconic ground force commander, took a company of mixed Pax and Home Guard troopers and set out in crawlers and tracked APCs. They were ambushed 100 clicks short of the plateau approach, and only Piet and half his command returned to St. Malachi. By the second week, reports came in of Palestinian attacks on a dozen garrison posts in both hemispheres. All contact was lost with Hellas contingent, and the South Polar Station radioed the Jibril that it was preparing to surrender to the attacking forces. Governor Claire Palo, working out of a small office that had belonged to one of her aides, conferred with Archbishop Robeson and the Grand Inquisitor, and released tactical fusion and plasma weapons to the beleaguered garrisons. Cardinal Mustafa agreed to the use of the Jibril as a weapons platform in the struggle against the Palestinians, and South Polar 1 was slagged from orbit. The Home Guard, Pax, Fleet Marines, Swiss Guard, and Holy Office commands concentrated on making sure that the capital of St. Malachi, its cathedral, and the governor's palace were secure from attack. In the relentless dust storm, any indigene that approached within 8 clicks of the city perimeter and who was not wearing a Pax-issued transponder was lanced and the bodies recovered later. A few were Palestinian guerrillas.
"The Simoom can't last forever," grumbled Commander Browning, the head of the Holy Office Security Forces.
"It can last another 3 to 4 standard months," said Major Piet, his upper torso bulky in a burn cast. "Perhaps longer." The work of the Holy Office Inquisition was going nowhere. The militia troopers who had first discovered the massacre in Arafat Kafie were interviewed again under the Truth Tell and Neuroprobe, but their stories remained the same. The Holy Office forensic experts worked with the coroners at St. Malachi's infirmary only to confirm that none of the 362 corpses could be resurrected. The Shrike had ripped out every node and millifiber of their cruciforms. Queries were sent back to Pachem via instantaneous drive drone regarding the identities of the victims, and, more importantly, the nature of the Opus Dei operations on Mars and the reasons for the advanced spaceport. But when a drone returned after 14 local days, it brought only the IDs of the murdered, and no explanation of their connection to Opus Dei or the motives for that organization's efforts on Mars. After 15 days of dust storm, more reports of continued Palestinian attacks on convoys and garrisons, and long days of interrogation and evidence sifting that led nowhere, the Grand Inquisitor was happy to hear Captain Woolmack call on secure tight beam from the Jibril to announce that there was an emergency that would require the Grand Inquisitor and his entourage to return to orbit as soon as possible. The Jibril was one of the newest Archangel-class starships, and it looked functional and deadly to Cardinal Mustafa as their dropships closed the last few kilometers to rendezvous. The Grand Inquisitor knew little about Pax warships, but even he could see that Captain Woolmack had morphed the starship to battle readiness. The various booms and sensor arrays had been drawn in beneath the starship's skin, the bulge of the Gideon drive had sprouted laser-reflective armor, and the various weapons portals were cleared for action. Behind the Archangel, Mars turned, a dust-shrouded disk the color of dried blood. Cardinal Mustafa hoped that this would be his last view of the place. Father Farrell pointed out that all 8 of the Mars System Task Force's torch ships were within 500 clicks of the Jibril, a tight defensive grouping by space-going standards, and the Grand Inquisitor realized that something serious was in the offing. Mustafa's dropship was the first to dock, and Woolmack met them in the airlock antechamber. The interior containment field gave them gravity.
"My apologies for interrupting your inquisition, Your Excellency," began the captain.
"Never mind that," said Cardinal Mustafa, shaking sand from the folds of his robe. "What is so important, Captain?" Woolmack blinked at the entourage emerging from the airlock behind the Grand Inquisitor. Father Farrell, of course, followed by Security Commander Browning, 3 Holy Office aides, Marine Sergeant Nell Kasner, the Resurrection Chaplain Bishop Erdl, and Major Piet, the former Ground Force commander whom Cardinal Mustafa had liberated from Governor Palo's service. The Grand Inquisitor saw the captain's hesitation. "You can speak freely, Captain. All in this group have been cleared by the Holy Office." Woolmack nodded.
"Your Excellency, we have found the ship."
Cardinal Mustafa must have stared his incomprehension.
"A heavy-duty freighter that must have left Mars orbit on the day of the massacre, Your Excellency," continued the captain. "We knew that their dropships had rendezvoused with some ship that day."
"Yes," said the Grand Inquisitor, "but we assumed it would be long gone, translated to whatever star system it was bound for."
"Yes, sir," said Woolmack, "but on the off chance that the ship never had spun up to C+, I had the dropships do an in-system search. We found the freighter in the system's asteroid belt."
"Was that its destination?" asked Mustafa. The captain was shaking his head.
"I think not, Excellency. The freighter is cold and dead. It's tumbling. Our instruments show no life on board, no systems powered up, not even the fusion drive."
But it is a starship freighter?" questioned Father Farrell. Captain Woolmack turned toward the tall, thin man.
"Yes, Father, the HHMS Saigon Maru, a 3-million-ton ore and bulk freighter that's seen service since the days of the hegemony."
"Mercantilus," the Grand Inquisitor said softly. Woolmack looked grim.
"Originally, Your Excellency, but our records show that the Saigon Maru was decommissioned from the mercantilist fleet and rendered into scrap metal 8 standard years ago."
Cardinal Mustafa and Father Farrell exchanged glances.
"Have you boarded this ship yet, Captain?"
asked Commander Browning.
"No," said Woolmack. "Because of the political implications, I thought it best if His Excellency were aboard and authorized such a search."
"Very good," said the Grand Inquisitor.
"Also," said Captain Woolmack, "I wanted the full complement of Marines and Swiss Guard troopers aboard first."
"Why is that, sir?" asked Major Piet. His uniform looked bulky over his burn cast.
"Something's not right,"
said the captain, looking at the major and then at the Grand Inquisitor. "Something's very much not right." More than 200 light-years from Mars system, Task Force Gideon was completing its task of destroying Lucifer. The seventh and final ouster system in their punitive expedition was the hardest to finish off. A yellow G-type star with 6 worlds, 2 of them inhabitable without terraforming, the system was crawling with ousters. Military bases out beyond the asteroids, berthing rocks in the asteroid belt, angel environments around the innermost water world, refueling depots in low orbit around the gas giant, and an orbital forest being grown between what would have been the orbits of Venus and old Earth in the old Sol system. It took Gideon 10 standard days to search out and kill a majority of these nodes of ouster life. When they were done, Admiral Aldecalde called for a physical conference of the 7 captains aboard His Holiness's ship Uriel, and revealed that their plans had been changed. The expedition had been so successful that they would seek out new targets and continue the attack. Aldecalde had dispatched a Gideon Drive drone to Pachem system and received permission to extend the mission. The 7 Archangels would translate to the nearest Pax base, Tau Ceti system, where they would be rearmed, refitted, refueled, and joined by 5 new Archangels. Probes had already targeted a dozen new ouster systems, none of which had yet received news of the massacre along Task Force Gideon's swath of destruction. Counting resurrection time, they would be attacking again within 10 standard days. The 7 captains returned to their 7 ships and prepared for the translation from target system Lucifer to Tau Ceti Center Base. Did they really take TC2? Oh, that's the Pax base, not the ouster base. My brain was like, wait a minute. Don't the Pax live there? Never mind, sorry, my brain just did not get that. Aboard the HHS Raphael, Commander Hogan Hogue Liebler was uneasy. Besides his official capacity as executive officer of the starship, second in command to Father Captain de Soya, Liebler was paid to spy on the Father Captain and to report any suspicious behavior. First to the Chief of Holy Office Security aboard Admiral Aldecalde's flagship, the Uriel, and then, as far as the executive officer could tell, all the way up the chain of command to the legendary Cardinal Ordusame. Liebler's problem at the moment was that he was suspicious, but could not articulate the cause for his suspicions. The spy could hardly tight-beam the Uriel with the dangerous news that the crew of Father Captain de Soya's Raphael had been going to confession too frequently, but that was precisely one of the causes of Liebler's concern. Of course, Hogue Liebler was not a spy by training or inclination. He was a gentleman of reduced circumstances, forced first by financial constraints to exercise a Renaissance minor gentleman's option of joining the military, and then constrained further by loyalty to his Pax and Church. He convinced himself, more than by the constant need for money to reclaim and restore his estates, into spying on his captain. The confessions were not all that out of the ordinary. The crew was made up of faithful Church and confession-going, born-again Christian soldiers, of course, and the circumstances in which they found themselves, the possibility of a true and eternal death if one of the ouster fusion weapons or K-beams made it through defensive containment fields, certainly added to the urgency of that faith. But Liebler sensed some extra factor at work in all these confessions since Target System Mammon. During the lulls in vicious fighting here in Target System Lucifer, the entire crew and Swiss Guard complement of the Raphael, some 27 hands in all, not counting the bewildered executive officer, had been cycling through the confessional like spacers at an outback port whorehouse. And the confessional was the one place at which even the ship's executive officer could not linger and eavesdrop. Liebler could not imagine what conspiracy could possibly be afoot. Mutiny made no sense. First, it was unthinkable. No crew in the nearly 3 centuries of Pax fleet had ever mutinied or come close to mutiny. Second, it was absurd. Mutineers did not flock to the confessional to discuss the sin of planned mutiny with the captain of the ship. Perhaps Father Captain de Soya was recruiting these men and women for some nefarious deed, but Hogue Liebler could not imagine anything the priest captain could offer that would suborn these local Pax spacers and Swiss Guard troopers. The crew did not like Hogue Liebler. He was used to being disliked by classmates and shipmates. It was the curse of his natural-born aristocracy, he knew. But he could not imagine them banding together to plan some evil deed directed his way. If Father Captain de Soya had somehow seduced this crew into treason, the worst they could do was attempt to steal the Archangel. Liebler suspected that this remote possibility was the reason he had been placed aboard as a spy. But to what end? Raphael was never out of touch with the other Archangels in the Gideon Task Force, except for the instant of C+ translation and the 2 days of hurried resurrection. So if the crew turned traitor and attempted to steal the ship, the other 6 Archangels would cut them down in an instant. The thought made Hogue Liebler physically queasy. He disliked dying and did not wish to do so more than necessary. Moreover, it would not help his career as a restored Lord of the Manor on Renaissance Minor if his service duty was remembered as being part of the crew that turned treasonous. It was possible, he realized, that Cardinal Lord Ducemy, or whoever was at the apex of his espionage food chain, might have him tortured, excommunicated, and executed to the true death, along with the rest of the crew, just to conceal the fact that the Vatican had put a spy aboard. This thought made Hogue Liebler more than queasy. He consoled himself with the thought that such an act of treason was not just unlikely, it was insane. It was not like the old days on Old Earth or some other water world that Liebler had read about, where an ocean-going warship goes rogue and turns pirate, preying on merchant ships and terrorizing ports. There was nowhere for a stolen Archangel to run to, nowhere to hide, and nowhere to rearm and refit the ship. Pax fleet would have their guts for garters. Commander Hogue Liebler continued to feel queasy and uneasy despite all this forced logic. He was on the flight deck 4 hours into their spin-up to the translation point to Tau Ceti system when the priority squirt came in from Uriel. 5 Ouster Torchship-class destroyers had been hiding in the charged particle dust torus of the inner moon of the outer gas giant and were now making a run toward their own translation points, using the G-type sun as a shield between them and the Gideon Task Force. The Gabriel and Raphael were to deviate from their translation arcs enough to find a firing trajectory for their remaining C+ hyperkinetic missiles, destroy the torch ships, and then to resume their exits from Lucifer's system. Uriel estimated that the 2 Archangels could spin up to translation about 8 hours after the other 5 ships had departed. Father Captain de Soya acknowledged the squirt and ordered a change of course, and Commander Liebler monitored the tight beam traffic as Mother Captain Stone aboard Gabriel did it likewise.
"The Admiral isn't leaving Raphael behind alone," thought the executive officer. "My masters aren't the only ones that don't trust de Soya."
It was not an exciting chase, not actually a chase at all when it came down to it. Given the gravitational dynamics of this system, it would take the old Hawking Drive Ouster torch ships about 14 hours to reach relativistic velocities prior to spin-up. The 2 Archangels would be in firing position within 4 hours. The Ousters had no weapons that could reach all the way across this system to hurt the Archangels. Both Gabriel and Raphael had enough weaponry in their depleted stock to destroy the torch ships a dozen times over. If all else failed, they would use the hated death beams. Commander Liebler had the con. The priest captain had gone to his cubby to catch a few hours of sleep, when the 2 Archangels cleared the sun for a firing solution. The rest of Task Force Gideon had long since translated. Liebler turned in his acceleration chair to buzz the captain when suddenly the blast portal irised, and Father Captain de Soya and several others stepped in. For a moment, Liebler forgot his suspicions. forgot even that he had been paid to be suspicious, as he goggled at the unlikely group. Besides the captain, there was that Swiss Guard sergeant, Gregorius, and 2 of his troopers. Also in attendance were Weapons System Officer, Wizzo, Commander Carol Sean, Energy Systems Officer, Esso, Lieutenant Paul Danish, Environmental Systems Officer, Viro, Commander Betts Argyle, and Propulsion Systems Engineer, GoPro, Lieutenant Elijah Hussein Meyer. "What in the hell?" began Executive Officer, XO, Liebler, and then stopped. The Swiss Guard sergeant was holding a neural stunner, and it was aimed at Liebler's face. Hogue Liebler had been carrying a concealed flechette pistol in his boot for weeks, but he forgot about it completely at this moment. He had never had a weapon aimed at him before, not even a stunner, and the effect of it made him want to urinate down his own pant leg. He concentrated on not doing that. This left little room to concentrate on anything else. One of the female troopers came over and lifted the pistol out of his boot. Liebler stared at it as if he had never seen it before. "Hogue," said Father Captain de Soya, "I'm sorry about this. We took a vote and decided that there was no time to try to convince you to join us. You're going to have to go away for a while." Summoning up all the dialogue he had ever heard from holodramas, Liebler began blustering. "You'll never get away with this. The Gabriel will destroy you. You'll all be tortured and hanged. They'll rip your cruciforms right out of your—" The stunner in the giant sergeant's hand hummed. Hogue Liebler would have gone face down onto the deck if the female trooper had not caught him and lowered him carefully to the deck plates. Father Captain de Soya took his place in the command chair. "Break away from this course," he said to Lieutenant Meyer at the helm. "Set in our translation coordinates. Full emergency acceleration. Go to full combat readiness." The priest captain glanced down at Liebler. "Put him in his resurrection crash and set it to store." The troopers carried out the sleeping man. Even before Father Captain de Soya ordered the ship's internal containment field set to 0G for battle stations, the priest captain had that brief but exhilarating sense of flying one feels in the instant after having jumped off a cliff, before gravity reasserts its absolute imperatives. In truth, their ship was now groaning under more than 600 gravities of fusion acceleration, almost 180% of normal high boost. Any interruption in the containment field would kill them in less than an instant. But the translation point was now less than 40 minutes away. De Soya was not sure that what he was doing was right. The thought of being a traitor to his church and Pax fleet was the most terrible thing in the world to him. But he knew that if he did indeed have an immortal soul, he had no other choice in the matter. Actually, what made Father Captain de Soya think that a miracle might be involved, or at least that a very improbable stroke of luck had occurred, was the fact that 7 others had agreed to come along with him in this doomed mutiny. 8, including himself, out of a crew of 28. The other 20 were sleeping off neural stuns in their resurrection crashes. De Soya knew that the 8 of them could handle Raphael's systems and tasks under most circumstances. He was lucky, or blessed, that several of the essential flight officers had come along. In the beginning, he thought it was going to be Gregorius, his 2 young troopers, and himself. The first suggestion of mutiny had come from the 3 Swiss Guard soldiers after their cleansing of the second berthing asteroid in Lucifer's system. Despite their oaths to the Pax, the Church, and the Swiss Guard, the slaughter of infants had been too much like murder for them. Lancers Donna Fu and Enos Del Reno had first gone to their sergeant, and then come with Gregorius to Father Captain de Soya's confessional with their plan to defect. Originally, they had asked for absolution if they decided to jump ship in the ouster system. De Soya had asked them to consider an alternate plan. The propulsion systems engineer, Lieutenant Meyer, had come to confession with the same concerns. The wholesale slaughter of the beautiful force field angels, which he had watched in tactical space, had sickened the young man and made him want to return to his ancestral religions of Judaism and Islam. Instead, he had gone to confession to admit his spiritual weakening. Father Captain de Soya had amazed Meyer by telling him that his concerns were not in conflict with true Christianity. In the days that followed, Environmental Systems Officer Commander Betts Argyle and Energy Systems Officer Lieutenant Paul Daniche followed their consciences to the confessional. Daniche was among the hardest to convince, but long, whispered conversations with his cubby-mate, Lieutenant Meyer, brought him around, I would think. Wizzo Commander Carol Shan was the last to join. The weapons system officer could no longer authorize death beam attacks. He had not slept in 3 weeks. De Soya had realized during their last day in Lucifer system that none of the other officers was about to defect. They saw their work as distasteful but necessary. When push came to shove, he realized the majority of flight officers and the remaining 3 Swiss Guard troopers would have sided with XO Hogue Liebler. Father Captain de Soya and Sergeant Gregorius decided not to give them the chance.
"The Gabriel is hailing us, Father Captain," said Lieutenant Daniche. The SO was plugged into ComTact as well as into his energy systems console. De Soya nodded. "Everyone make sure your couch crashes are active." It was an unnecessary order, he knew. Every crew member went into battle stations or C+ translation in his or her acceleration couch, each rigged as an automated resurrection creche. Before jacking into tactical, De Soya checked their trajectory on the center pit display. They were pulling away from Gabriel, although the other Archangel had gone to 300 gravities of boost and had altered course to parallel Raphael's. Across Lucifer's solar system, the 5 ouster torch ships were still crawling toward their own translation points. De Soya wished them well, knowing all the while that the only reason the ships still existed was the momentary distraction Raphael's puzzling course change had caused for Gabriel. He plugged into Command TACSIM. Instantly, he was a giant standing in space. The 6 worlds and countless moons and nascent, burning orbital forests of Lucifer spread out at his belt level. Far beyond the burning sun, the 6 ouster motes balanced on tiny fusion tails. Gabriel's tail was much longer, Raphael's the longest yet, its brilliance rivaling the central stars. Mother Captain Stone stood waiting a few giant's paces from De Soya.
"Federico," she said, "what in Christ's name are you doing?"
De Soya had considered not answering Gabriel's hail. It would have offered them a few more minutes. If it would have offered them a few more minutes, he would have stayed silent. But he knew Stone. She would not hesitate. On a separate tactical channel, he glanced at the translation plot. 36 minutes to shift point.
"Captain, 4 missile launches detected. Translating now."
It was Wizzo Commander Shan on the secure conduction line. Father Captain de Soya felt sure that he had not visibly jumped or reacted in front of Mother Captain Stone in tactical. On his own bone line, he subvocalized, "It's all right, Carol. I can see them on tack. They've translated toward the ouster ships." To Stone, he said on tactical, "You've launched against the ousters." Stone's face was tight, even in sunlight.
"Of course. Why haven't you, Federico?"
Rather than answer, De Soya stepped closer to the central sun and watched the missiles emerge from Hawking Drive immediately in front of the 6 ouster torch ships. They detonated within seconds, 2 fusion followed by 2 broader plasma. All of the ousters had their defensive containment fields to maximum, an orange glow in tactical sim, but the close-range bursts overloaded all of them. The images went from orange to red to white, and then 3 of the ships simply ceased to exist as material objects. 2 became scattered fragments tumbling toward the now infinitely distant translation points. One torch ship remained intact, but its containment field dropped away, and its fusion tail disappeared. If anyone aboard had survived the blast effects, they were now dead of the sleet storm of undeflected radiation that was tearing through the ship.
What are you doing, Federico?
Repeated Mother Captain Stone. De Soya knew that Stone's first name was Halen. He chose not to make his part of the conversation personal. Following orders, Mother Captain. Even in tact sim, Stone's expression was dubious.
What are you talking about, Father Captain de Soya?
Both knew that the conversation was being recorded. Whoever survived the next few minutes would have a record of the exchange. De Soya kept his voice steady. Admiral Aldecacti's flagship tight-beamed to us with a change of orders 10 minutes before the flagship translated. We are carrying those orders. Stone's expression was impassive, but De Soya knew that she was sub-vocalizing her XO to confirm that there had been a tight-beam transmission between Uriel and Raphael at that time. There had been, but the substance of it had been trivial, updating rendezvous coordinates for the Tau Ceti system.
What were the orders, Father Captain de Soya?
They were eyes only, Mother Captain Stone. They do not concern the Gabriel. On the bone circuit, he said to Wizzo Shan, "Lock on death beam coordinates and give me the actuator as discussed." A second later, he felt the tact sim weight of an energy weapon in his right hand. The gun was invisible to Stone, but perfectly tactile to De Soya. He tried to make his hand on the butt of the weapon look relaxed as his finger curled around the invisible trigger. De Soya could tell from the casual way that Mother Captain Stone's arm hung free from her body that she was also carrying a virtual weapon. They stood about 3 meters apart in tact sim space. Between them, Raphael's long fusion tail and Gabriel's shorter pillar of flame climbed toward chest height from the plane of the ecliptic.
Father Captain de Soya, your new translation point will not take you to Tau Ceti's system as ordered.
Those orders were superseded, Mother Captain. De Soya was watching his former first officer's eyes. Halen was always good at concealing her emotions and intentions. He had lost to her in poker on more than one occasion on their old torch ship, Balthazar.
What is your new destination, Father Captain?
33 minutes to shift point. Classified, Mother Captain. I can tell you this. Raphael will be rejoining the task force in Tau Ceti system after our mission is completed. With her right hand, Stone rubbed her cheek. De Soya watched the curled finger of her right hand. She would not have to raise the invisible handgun to trigger the death beam, but it was human instinct to aim the firearm at one's opponent. De Soya hated death beams, and he knew that Stone did as well. They were cowardly weapons, banned by the Pax fleet and the Church until this expedition. They were cowardly weapons, banned by Pax fleet and the Church until this expeditionary force incursion. Unlike the old hegemony-era death wands that actually cast a scythe-like beam of neural disruption, no coherent projection was involved in the ship-to-target death beam. Essentially, the powerful Gideon drive accumulators extended a C-plus distortion of space-time within a finite cone. The result was a subtle twisting of the real-time matrix, similar to a failed translation into the old Hawking drive space, but more than enough to destroy the delicate energy dance that was a human brain. But however much Stone held the Pax fleet officer's hatred of death beams, it made sense for her to use it now. The Raphael represented a staggering investment of Pax funds. Her first goal would be to stop the crew from stealing it without damaging the ship. Her problem, however, was that killing the crew with death beams probably would not stop the Raphael from translating, depending upon how much of the spin-up had been pre-programmed by her crew. It was traditional for a captain to make the actual translation manually, or at least to be ready to override the ship's computer with a dead man's switch, but Stone had no assurance that De Soya would follow tradition.
Please let me speak to Commander Liebler,
said Mother Captain Stone. De Soya smiled.
My executive officer is attending to duties, he thought.
So Hogue was the spy. This is the confirmation we needed.
Gabriel could not catch them now, not even by accelerating to 600 gravities herself. Raphael would have reached translation requirements before the other ship could get within tow range. No, to stop them, Stone would have to kill the crew and then disable the ship by using the last of her physical arsenal to overload Raphael's external containment fields. If she was wrong, if de Soya was acting under last-minute orders, she would almost certainly be court-martialed and expelled from Pax's fleet. If she did nothing, and de Soya was stealing one of the Pax's archangels, Stone would be court-martialed, expelled, excommunicated, and almost certainly executed.
Federico, she said softly, please reduce thrust so that we can match velocities. You can still follow orders and spin up to your secret coordinates. I ask only that I board the Raphael and confirm that everything is all right before you translate.
De Soya hesitated. He could not use the guise of orders for his precipitous departure under 600 gravities, since wherever Raphael ended up, there would be 2 days of slow resurrection for the crew before the mission could continue. He watched Stone's eyes while also checking the tiny image of Gabriel on its 300-gravity pillar of white fire. She might try overloading his fields with a salvo of her remaining conventional weaponry. De Soya had no wish to return a missile or lance fire. A vaporized Gabriel was not acceptable. He was now a traitor to church and state, but he had no intention of becoming a true death murderer. The death beams it had to be, then.
All right, Halen, he said easily. I'll tell Hogue to drop to 200 Gs long enough for you to come alongside.
He turned his head as if concentrating on issuing bone channel orders. His hand must have twitched. Stone's did as well, the invisible handgun rising a bit as her finger tightened on the trigger. In the split second before the disruption struck, Father Captain de Soya saw the 8 sparks leaving the sim-tacked Gabriel. Stone was taking no chances. She would vaporize Raphael rather than have it escape. The Mother Captain's virtual image flew backward and evaporated as the death beam tore into her ship, severing all comm connections as the humans aboard died. Less than a second later, Father Captain de Soya felt himself jerked out of sim space as the neurons in his brain literally fried. Blood flew from his eyes, mouth, and ears, but the priest captain was already dead, as was every conscious entity on the Raphael. Sergeant Gregorius and his 2 troopers on C-Deck, GoPro Meyer, Viro Argyle, Esso Danish, and Wizzo Shan on the flight deck. 16 seconds later, the 8 Hawking Drive missiles flashed into real space and detonated on every side of the silent Raphael. Gyges watched in real time as Raul Endymion said goodbye to the family in red robes and paddled his kayak toward the Farcaster Arch. The world was in dual lunar eclipse. Fireworks exploded above the Canal River, and strange ululations came from the thousands of throats back in the linear city. Gyges stood and prepared to walk out across the water to pluck the man from his kayak. It had been agreed that if Raul Endymion was alone, that he needed to be kept alive for interrogation in the starship waiting above. Finding the girl Ania's whereabouts was the goal of this mission, but no one said anything about not making it more difficult for the man to fight or escape. While still phase-shifted, Gyges planned to hamstring Endymion and sever the tendons in his forearms. He could do that instantly, surgically, so that there would be no danger of the human bleeding to death before being stored in the ship's dock-in-the-box before interrogation. Gyges had jogged the 6 clicks to the Farcaster Arch in no time, checking out pedestrians and the strange wind carts as he passed the frozen forms and figures. Once at the arch and concealed in a patch of willows on the canal's high bank, he shifted back to slow time. His job was to guard the back door. Nemes would ping him when she found the missing spacer. During the 20 minutes of waiting, Gyges communicated with Scylla and Briareus on the internal common band, but heard nothing from Nemes. This was surprising. They had all assumed that she would find the missing man within the first few seconds of real time after she had shifted up. Gyges was not worried. He was not actually capable of worry in the true sense of the word, but he assumed that Nemes had been searching in widening arcs, using up real time by frequently shifting down and then back up. He assumed that his common band queries had been made while she was phase-shifted. Added to that was his understanding that while Nemes was a clone sibling, she had been the first to be devatted. She was less used to common band sharing than Scylla, Briareus, and he. To be truthful, Gyges would not have minded if their orders had been simply to pull Nemes out of the rock on Godsgrove and terminate her there and then. Or then and there, which is what is actually written. The river was busy, each time a ship approached the Farcaster Arch from either the west or east. Gyges shifted up and walked across the spongy surface of the river to search it and check on its passengers. Some he had to disrobe to ascertain that it was not Endymion or the android A. Betic or the girl Ania in disguise. To be sure, he sniffed them and took needle biopsies of the robed one's DNA to make sure that they were natives of Vetus Grey Balianus B. All were. After each inspection, he would walk back to the bank and resume his watch. 18 minutes after he had left the ship, a packed skimmer flew around and through the Farcaster Arch. It would have been tiring for Gyges to have to board it in fast time, but Scylla was already aboard with the searching pack's troopers, so he was spared the effort.
This is tiresome. This is tiresome, she said on the common band.
Yes, agreed Gyges.
Where is Nemes?
It was Briareus back in the city. The clumsy troopers had received their radioed search warrant and were going from house to house.
I haven't heard from her, said Gyges.
It was during the eclipse and the accompanying ceremonial nonsense that he watched the wind cycle wagon pull to a halt and Raul Endymion emerge. Gyges was sure that it was Endymion. Not only did the visuals match perfectly, but he picked up the personal scent that Nemes had downloaded to them. Gyges could have phase-shifted immediately, walked over to the frozen tableau, and taken a DNA sample. Damn it. Gyges was sure that it was Endymion. Not only did the visuals match perfectly, but he picked up the personal scent that Nemes had downloaded to them. Gyges could have phase-shifted immediately, walked over to the frozen tableau, and taken a DNA needle biopsy, but he did not have to. This was their man. Instead of broadcasting on the common band or pinging Nemes, Gyges wasted another minute. This anticipation was pleasurable to him. He did not want to dilute it by sharing it. Besides, he reasoned, it would be better to abduct Endymion after he had separated from... Besides, he reasoned, it would be better to abduct Endymion after he had separated from the Spectrum Helix family, who even now were waving goodbye to the man in the kayak. Gyges watched while Raul and Endymion paddled the absurd little boat out into the current of the widening canal river. He realized that it would be best to take the kayak as well as Endymion. The watching Spectrum Helix people would be expecting him to disappear if they knew that he was trying to escape via Farcaster. From their point of view, there would be a flash and Endymion would have Farcast out of sight. In reality, Gyges would still be phase-shifted, now carrying the man and kayak within the expanded phase-shift field. The kayak might also be useful in revealing where the girl, Ania, was hiding, telltale planetary scents, methods of manufacture. Along the riverbanks to the north, people cheered and sang. The lunar eclipse was complete. Fireworks exploded above the river and cast baroque shadows on the rusted Farcaster Arch. Endymion turned his attention away from the waving Spectrum Helix family and concentrated on staying in the strongest current as he paddled toward the Farcaster. Gyges stood, stretched languidly, and prepared to phase-shift. Suddenly, the thing was next to him, centimeters away, at least 3 meters tall, towering over him.
Impossible. thought Gyges. I would have sensed the phase shift distortions.
Exploding skyrockets spilled blood-red light on the chrome carapace. Metal teeth and chrome spikes twisted the expanding flowers of yellow, white, and red across quicksilver planes. Gyges caught an instant's look at his own reflection, distorted and startled, and then he phase-shifted. It took less than a microsecond for the shift. Somehow, one of the creature's 4 clawed hands... It has 4 hands, there are 4 of them. I think it has more than 4 fingers per hand. It took less than a microsecond for the shift. Somehow, one of the creature's 4 clawed hands made it into the field before it completely formed. Bladed fingers dug through sin flesh and muscle, seeking one of Gyges' hearts. Gyges paid no heed to the attack, but attacked in return, swinging his silvered, phase-shifted arm like a horizontal guillotine. It could have cut through whiskered carbon alloy as if it were wet cardboard. It did not cut through the tall form in front of him. Sparks and thunder exploded as his arm bounced away, fingers numbed, metal radius and ulna shattered. The clawed hand within him pulled out ropes of intestine, kilometers of microfiber optics. Gyges realized that he had been opened from navel to breastbone. It did not matter. He could still function. Gyges clenched his right hand into a sharpened bludgeon and thrust it forward into gleaming red eyes. It was a killing blow. But the great steam shovel jaws opened, closed, faster than phase shifting, and Gyges' right arm suddenly ended above the wrist. Gyges threw himself at the apparition, trying to merge fields, attempting to get his own teeth within tearing distance. 2 huge hands seized him, the bladed fingers sinking through shift field and flesh to hold him tight. The chrome skull in front of him slashed forward. Needle spikes pierced Gyges' right eye and penetrated the right frontal lobe of his brain. Gyges screamed then, not out of pain, although he felt something similar for the first time in his short life, but out of pure, relentless rage. His teeth snapped and clacked like steel rendering blades as he sought the creature's throat, but he continued being held at 3 arms' length. Then the monster ripped out both of Gyges' hearts and threw them far out over the water. A nanosecond later, it lunged forward, biting through Gyges' throat and severing his carbon alloy spinal cord with a single snap of long teeth. Gyges' head was severed from his body. He tried to shift to telemetric control of the still fighting body, peering through blood and fluid out of his remaining eye and broadcasting over the common band, but the transmitter in his skull had been pierced, and the receiver in his spleen had been ripped away. The world spun. First the corona of the emerging sun around the second moon, then skyrockets, then the color-dappled surface of the river, then the sky again, then darkness. With fading coherence, Gyges realized that his head had been thrown far out into the river. His last retinal image before being submerged in darkness was of his own headless and uselessly spasming body being hugged to the carapace of the creature and being impaled there on spikes and thorns. Then, with a flash, the Shrike phase-shifted out of even fast-time existence, and Gyges' head struck the water and sank beneath the dark waves. Rhadamanth Nemes arrived 5 minutes later. She shifted down. The riverbank was empty except for the headless corpse of her sibling. The wind cycle wagon and its red-robed family were gone. No boats were visible on this section of the river. The sun was beginning to emerge from behind the second moon.
Gyges is here,
she sent on the common band. Briareus and Scylla were still with the troops in the city. The sleeping Pax trooper had been found and released from his handcuffs. None of the citizens would say whose home it was. Scylla was urging Colonel Vinara to drop the matter. Nemes felt the discomfort as she left the shift field. All of her ribs, bone and permasteel, were either fractured or bent. Several of her internal organs had been pulped. Her left hand would not function. She had been unconscious for almost 20 standard minutes. Unconscious. She had not lost consciousness for 1 second in the 4 years she had lain in the solidified rock of God's Grove. And all this damage had been done through the impenetrable shift field. It did not matter. She would allow her body to repair itself during the days of inactivity after leaving this core-forsaken world. Nemes knelt next to her sibling's corpse. It had been clawed, decapitated, and eviscerated, almost deboned. It was still twitching, the broken fingers struggling to get a grip on an absent enemy. Nemes shuddered. Not out of sympathy for Gyges or revulsion at the damage done. She was professionally evaluating the Shrike's attack pattern and felt admiration, if anything, but out of sheer frustration that she had missed this confrontation. The attack in the tunnel had been too fast for her to react. She had been in mid-phase shift, which she would have thought impossible.
"I'll find him,"
she sent and shifted up. The air grew thick and sludge-like. Nemes went down the bank, forced her way through the thick resistance of the water's surface, and walked out along the riverbed, calling on the common band and probing with deep radar. She found Gyges' head almost a click downstream. The current was strong here. Freshwater crustaceans had already eaten the lips and the remaining eye and were probing in the eye sockets. Crabs work quick. Nemes brushed them away and took the head back to the bank of the canal river. Gyges' common band transmitter was smashed and his vocal cords were gone. Nemes extruded a fiber optic filament and made the connection directly to his memory center. His skull had been smashed on the left side, and brain matter and bits of DNA processing gel were spilling out. She did not ask him questions. She phased down and downloaded the memory, squirting it to her remaining 2 siblings as she received it.
"Shrike,"
sent Scylla.
No shit, Sherlock,
sent Briarius.
"Silence," ordered Nemes. "Finish up with those idiots. I'll clean things up here and be waiting for the dropship. Waiting in the dropship. Sorry."
The Gyges head, blind, leaking, was trying to speak, using what remained of its tongue to shape sibilant and glottal syllables. Nemes held it close to her ear.
Please. Help.
Me.
Nemes lowered the head and studied the body on the splattered bank. Many organs were missing. Scores of meters of microfiber were spilled in the weeds and mud, some trailing away in the current. Gray intestines and neural gel packs were split and scattered. Bits of bone caught the growing light as the sun emerged from twice darkness. Neither the dropship nor the old Archangel's dock-in-the-boxes could help the Vatborn, and Gyges might take standard months to heal himself. Nemes set the head down while she wrapped the body in its own microfilaments, weighting it outside and in with stones. Making sure that the river was still free of ships, she tossed the headless corpse far out into the current. She had seen that the river was alive with tough and indiscriminate scavengers. Even so, there were parts of her sibling that they would not find appetizing. She lifted Gyges' head. The tongue was still clucking. Using the eye sockets as grips for her thumb and forefinger, she threw the head far out over the river in an easy underhand toss. It went under with barely a ripple. Nemes jogged to the Farcaster arch, ripped a hidden access plate free from the rusting and supposedly impenetrable exterior, and extruded a filament from her wrist. She jacked in.
I don't understand,
came Briarius's code on the common band.
It opened to nowhere.
"Not to nowhere. sent Nemes, reeling in the filament. "Just to nowhere in the old web. Nowhere the core has built a Farcaster." "That's impossible," sent Scylla. "There are no Farcasters except for those the core has built."
Nemes sighed. Her siblings were idiots.
"Shut up and return to the dropship," she sent. "We have to report this in person. Counselor Albedo will want to download personally."
Nemes phase-shifted and jogged back to the dropship through air gone thick and sepia with slow stirred time. "12. I did not forget that there was a panic button. The problem is simple. When there is real panic, one does not immediately think of buttons. The kayak was falling into an endless depth of air broken only by clouds that rose tens of thousands of meters from the bruised purple depths to the milky ceiling of more clouds thousands of meters above me. I had dropped my paddle and watched it tumble away in freefall. The kayak and I were dropping faster than the paddle for reasons of aerodynamics and terminal velocity that were beyond my powers to calculate at that particular moment. Great oval surges of water from the river I had left behind were falling ahead and behind me, separating and shaping themselves into ovoid spheres I had seen in 0G, but then being whipped apart by the wind. It was as if I were falling in my own localized rainstorm. The flechette pistol I had liberated from the sleeping trooper in Demloa's bedroom was wedged between the outside of my thigh and the curved inner seal of the cockpit's skirt. My arms were raised as if I were a bird preparing to take flight. My fists were clenched in terror. After my original scream, I found my jaws locked shut, my molars grinding. The fall went on and on. I had caught a glimpse of the Farcaster arch above and behind me, although arch was no longer the proper word. The huge device floating unsupported was a metal ring, a torus, a rusty donut. For a fleeting second I saw the sky of Vitus Grey Balianus P through the glowing ring, and then the image faded, and only clouds showed through the receding hoop. It was the only substantial thing in the entire skyscape of clouds, and I had already fallen more than 1,000 meters below it. In a giddy, panicked moment of fantasy, I imagined that if I were a bird, I could fly back up to the Farcaster ring, perch on its broad lower arc, and wait for... Wait for what? I gripped the sides of the kayak as it rotated, turning me almost upside down as it plummeted bow first toward the purple depths, clicks and clicks below. That is when I remembered the panic button.
"Don't touch it, whatever you do,"
Ania had said when we floated the kayak in Hannibal.
"I mean, don't touch it until you absolutely have to."
The kayak spun on its longitudinal axis again, almost shaking me out. My butt was no longer touching the padded cushion on the bottom of the hull. I was floating free inside the cramped cockpit, within a free-falling constellation of water, tumbling paddle, and plunging kayak. I decided that this qualified as an absolutely have-to time. I flipped the plastic cover and depressed the red button with my thumb. Panels popped open in front of the cockpit, near the bow and behind me. I ducked as lines and masses of fabric billowed out. The kayak righted itself and then braked so hard that I was almost thrown out. I clung fiercely to the sides of the fiberglass boat as it rocked wildly. The shapeless mass over my head seemed to be forming itself into something more complicated than a parachute. Even in the middle of my adrenaline rush and molar-grinding panic, I recognized the fabric. Memory cloth that Abetic and I had bought at the Indian market near Taliesin West. The solar-powered piezoelectric material was almost transparent, ultralight, ultra-strong, and could remember up to a dozen preset configurations. We had considered buying more and using it to replace the canvas over the main architect's studio since the old covers sagged, rotted, and had to be repaired and replaced regularly. But Mr. Wright had insisted on keeping the old canvas. He preferred the buttery light. A. Bettick had taken the dozen or so meters of memory cloth down to his workshop, and I had thought no more of it. Until now. The fall was stopped. Now the kayak hung under a delta-shaped parasail supported by a dozen nylon 10 risers that rose from strategic positions along the upper hull. The boat and I were still descending, but in a gradual swoop now rather than a headlong fall. I looked up, but the memory cloth was clear enough to see through, but the Farcaster ring was too far behind me and hidden by clouds. The winds and air currents were carrying me away from the Farcaster. I suppose that I should have been grateful to my friends, the girl and the android, for somehow foreseeing this and preparing the kayak appropriately, but my first thought was an overwhelming, "God damn you!" This was too much. Being dropped into a world of clouds and air with no ground was too damned much. If Ania had known that I was being cast here, why didn't she... No ground? I leaned over the edge of the kayak and looked below. Perhaps the plan was for me to float gently down to some unseen surface. No. There were kilometers of empty air beneath me, and below that the lower layers were purple and black, a darkness relieved only by fierce slashes of lightning. The pressure down there must be terrible. Which brought up another point. If this was a Jovian world, Whirl or Jupiter or one of the others, how was it that I was breathing oxygen? As far as I knew, all of the gas giants that humanity had encountered were made up of unfriendly gases: methane, ammonia, helium, carbon monoxide, phosphine, hydrogen cyanide, other nasties, with trace amounts of water. I had never heard of a gas giant with breathable oxygen-nitrogen mix, but I was breathing. The air was thinner here than on the other worlds I had traveled through, and it stank a bit of ammonia, but I was definitely breathing air. Then it must not be a gas giant. Where the hell was I? I lifted my wrist and spoke to the comm-log. "Where the hell am I?" There was a hesitation, and for a moment I thought the thing had been broken on Vitus Grey Balianus B. Then it spoke in the ship's supercilious voice. "Unknown, Endymion. I have some data, but it's incomplete." "Tell me." There followed a rapid-fire listing of temperatures in Kelvin, atmospheric pressure in millibars, estimated mean density in grams per centimeter cubed, probable escape velocity in kilometers per second, and perceived magnetic field in Gauss, followed by a long list of atmospheric gases and element ratios. "Escape velocity of 54.2 clicks per second," I said. "That's gas giant territory, isn't it?" "Most assuredly," said the ship's voice. "Jovian baseline is 59.5 kilometers per second." "But the atmosphere isn't like a gas giant's." I could see the stratocumulus ahead of me building, like a nature holo run at accelerated speeds. The towering cloud must have reached 10 clicks above me, its base disappearing in the purple depths below. Lightning flickered at its base. The sunlight on its far side seemed rich and low, evening light. "The atmosphere is unlike anything in my records," said the comm-log. "Carbon monoxide, ethane, acetylene, and other hydrocarbons violating Solmev equilibrium values can be easily explained by Jovian-style molecular kinetic energy and solar radiation breaking down methane, and the presence of carbon monoxide is a standard result of methane and water vapor mixing at deep layers where the temperature exceeds 1200 degrees Kelvin, but the oxygen and nitrogen levels—" "Yes?" I prompted. "Indicate life," said the comm-log. I turned completely around, inspecting the clouds and sky as if something were sneaking up on me. "Life on the surface?" I said. "Doubtful," came the flat voice. "If this world follows Jovian whirl norms, the pressure at the so-called surface would be under 70 million old Earth atmospheres with a temperature of some 25,000 degrees Kelvin." "How high are we?" I said.
Uncertain, said the instrument, but with the current atmospheric pressure of .76 old Earth standard on a standard Jovian world, I would estimate that we were above the troposphere and tropopause, actually in the lower reaches of the stratosphere. Wouldn't it be colder that high? That's almost outer space. Not on a gas giant, said the comlog in its insufferable professorial voice. The greenhouse effect creates a thermal inversion layer, heating layers of the stratosphere to an almost human optimum temperature. Although the difference of a few thousand meters may show pronounced temperature increases or drops. A few thousand meters, I said softly. How much air is above and below us? Unknown, said the comlog again, but extrapolation would suggest that equatorial radius from the center of this world to its upper atmosphere would be approximately 27,000 kilometers, with this oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide layer extending some 3,000 to 8,000 kilometers, approximately 2/3 of the distance from the planet's hypothetical center. A 3,000 to 8,000 click layer, I repeated stupidly, some 50,000 clicks above the surface. Approximately, said the comlog, although it should be noted that at near core pressures, molecular hydrogen becomes a metal. Yeah, I said, that's enough for now. I felt like I was going to be sick over the side of the kayak. I should point out the anomaly that the interesting coloration of the nearby stratocumulus suggests the presence of ammonium monosulfide or polysulfides, although at frickadoodle, that's a hard one. Although at apotropospheric altitudes, one would assume only the presence of ammonia cirrus clouds, with true water clouds not forming until depths reach some 10 standard atmospheres because of... Enough, I said. I only point this out because of the interesting atmospheric paradox involving... Shut up, I said. It got cold after the sun went down. The sunset itself I shall remember until I die. High, high above me, glimpses of what might be blue sky had darkened to a Hyperion-like deep lapis, and then deepened further to dark purple. The clouds all around me grew brighter as the sky far above and the depths far below both grew darker. I say clouds, but the generic term is laughably unequal to conveying the power and grandeur of what I watched. I grew up in a nomadic shepherd caravan on the treeless moors between Hyperion's Great South Sea and the Pinion Plateau. I know clouds. Far above me, feathered cirrus and rippled cirrocumulus caught the twilight in a pastel riot of soft pinks, rose glows, violet tinges, and golden light, and golden backlighting. It was as if I were in a temple with a high, rosy ceiling supported by thousands of irregular columns and pillars. The columns and pillars were towering mountains of cumulus and cumulonimbus, their anvil-shaped bases disappearing in the darkening depths hundreds or thousands of kilometers below my floating kayak, their rounded summits billowing high into the halo-tinged cirrostratus hundreds or thousands of kilometers above me. Each column of cloud caught the low, rich light passing through the openings in the cloud many thousands of clicks to the west, and the light seemed to ignite the clouds as if their surfaces were made of wildly flammable material. Ack. Sorry about that. Each column of cloud caught the low, rich light passing through openings in the cloud many thousands of clicks to the west, and the light seemed to ignite the clouds as if their surfaces were made of wildly flammable material. Monosulfide or polysulfides,
the comlog had said. Well, whatever constituted these tawny cumulus in the diffuse daylight, sunset set them afire with rust-red light, brilliant crimson streaks, bloody tractus streaming away from the main cloud masses like crimson pennants. Rose-colored fibratus weaving together the cirrus ceiling like muscle strands under the flesh of a living body, billowing masses of cumulus so white that they made me blink as if snow-blinded, golden, striated cirriforms spilling out from the boiling cumulonimbus towers like masses of blonde hair blowing back from pale, upturned faces. The light deepened, richened, became so intense that it brought tears to my eyes, and then it became even more brilliant. Great, nearly horizontal shafts of godlight burned between the columns, illuminating some here, casting others into shadow there, passing through ice clouds and bands of vertical rain on their way, spilling hundreds of simple rainbows and 1,000 multiple rainbows. Then shadows moved up from the bruise-black depths, shading more and more of the still writhing billows of cumulus and nimbus, finally climbing into the high cirrus and pond-rippled alto cumulus. But at first the shadows brought not grayness or darkness, but an infinite palette of subtleties, gleaming gold dimming to bronze, pure white becoming cream and then dimming to sepia and shade, crimson with the boldness of spilled blood slowly darkening to the rust red of dried blood, then fading to an autumnal tawny russet. The hull of my kayak lost its glint, and the parasail above me quit catching the light as this vertical terminator moved past and above me. Slowly these shadows crept higher. It must have taken at least 30 minutes, although I was too absorbed in watching to check my comlog. And when they reached the cirrus ceiling, it was as if someone had dimmed all the lights in the temple. It was one hell of a sunset. I remember thinking then, overwhelmed by the interplay of light and cloud shadow and the oddly disturbing kinetic restlessness of all those broiling cloud masses, ready to rest my eyes while true darkness fell and to gather my thoughts. And that is when the lightning and aurora began playing. There had been no aurora borealis on Hyperion, or if there had been, I had never seen it. But I had seen an example of old Earth's northern lights on a peninsula that had once been the Scandinavian Republic, while on my round-the-world dropship tour of that planet. They had been shimmering and goose-flesh producing, rippling and dancing along the northern horizon like the filmy gown of a ghost dancer. This world's aurora had none of that subtlety. Bands of light, solid striations of light, as discreet and discernible as the keys of a vertical piano, began dancing high in the sky in the direction I thought of as south. Other curtains of green, gold, red, and cobalt began shimmering against the dark world of air beneath me. These grew longer, broader, taller, stretching to meet and blend with other curtains of leaping electrons. It was as if the planet were cutting paper dolls out of shimmering light. Within minutes, every part of the sky was alive and dancing with vertical, slanted, and near-horizontal ribbons of banded color. The cloud towers became visible again, billows and pennants reflecting the strobe of thousands of these cold lights. I could almost hear the hiss and rasp of solar particles being driven along the terrifying lines of magnetic force, banding this giant world. I could hear them. Crashes, rumbles, snappings, loud pops, long chains of cracking sounds. I swiveled in my cockpit and leaned over the hull to look straight down. The lightning and thunder had begun. I had seen enough lightning storms as a child on the moors. On old Earth, Ania, Abetic, and I regularly used to sit outside her shelter in the evening and watch the great electrical storms move over the mountains to the north. Nothing had prepared me for this. The depths, as I had called them, had been little more than a dark floor so far below me as to be laughable, a broiling promise of terrible pressures and more terrible heat. But now those depths were alive with light, leaping with lightning storms that moved from one visible horizon to the rest like a chain of nuclear bombs going off. I could imagine entire hemispheres of cities being destroyed in one of those rumbling chain reactions of light. I gripped the side of the kayak and reassured myself that the storms were hundreds of clicks below me. The lightning moved up the towers of cumulonimbus. Flashes of internal white light vied with the shimmers of colored light from the connecting auroras. The thunder noise was subsonic, then sonic, subtly terrifying at first, then not subtle, but even more terrifying. The kayak and its parasail bucked and rocked in sudden downdrafts and elevator-quick lifts of thermals. I gripped the sides with mad strength and wished to God that I were on any other world but this. Then the lightning discharges began flashing from cloud tower to cloud tower. The comlog and my own reasoning had evaluated the scale of this place, an atmosphere tens of thousands of clicks deep, a horizon so far away that I could have dropped scores of old Earths or Hyperions between me and the sunset. But the lightning bolts finally convinced me that this was a world made for giants and gods, not for humankind. The electrical discharges were wider than the Mississippi and longer than the Amazon. I had seen those rivers, and I could see these bolts. I knew. I hunkered down in my little cockpit as if that would help me when one of these bolts caught my little flying kayak. The hairs on my forearms were standing straight up, and I realized that the crawling sensation I felt on my neck and scalp was precisely that. The hair on my head was writhing like a nest of snakes. The comlog was flashing overload alarms on its diski plate. It was probably shouting at me as well, but I could not have heard a laser cannon firing 10 centimeters from my ear in that maelstrom. The parasail rippled and tore as the risers as the parasail rippled and tore at the risers as heated air and imploding vacuums battered us. At one point, riding the wake of a bolt that blinded me, the kayak swung above horizontal, higher than the parasail. I was sure that the risers were going to collapse. The kayak and I were going to fall into the parasail shroud, and we would fall for minutes, hours, until pressure and heat ended my screaming. The kayak rocked back, then back again, then continued swinging like a maddened pendulum, but under the sail. In addition to the storm of lightning beneath me, in addition to the rising chain of explosions in every tower of cumulus, in addition to the searing bolts that now laced the towers like a web of firing neurons in a brain gone berserk, bundles of ball lightning and chain lightning suddenly began breaking loose from the clouds and floating in the dark spaces where my kayak flew. I watched one of these rippling, surging spheres of electricity drift not 100 meters beneath me. It was the size of a small, round asteroid, an electric moonlet. The noise it made was beyond description, but memories surged unbidden of being caught in a forest fire in the Aquila Fens, of the tornado that skipped over our caravan on the moors when I was 5 years old, of plasma grenades detonating against the great blue glacier of the Claw ice shelf. No combination of these memories could match the energy, violence, tumbling along beneath the kayak like some runaway boulder made of blue and gold light. The storm lasted more than 8 hours. Darkness lasted another 8. I survived the first. I slept through the last. When I awoke, shaken and thirsty, filled with dreams of light and noise, still partially deafened, badly needing to urinate and worried about falling out of the cockpit while I knelt to do so, I saw that morning light was painting the opposite side of the cloud pillars that had replaced the temple columns from the night before. Sunrise was simpler than sunset. The brilliant white and gold crawled down from the cirrus ceiling, along the roiling sides of the cumulus and nimbus, down to my lair where I sat shaking from the cold. My skin and clothes and hair were wet. Sometime during that night's bedlam it had rained on me, and rained hard. I got to my knees on the padded floor of the hull. held tight to the cockpit rim with my left hand, made sure that the kayak's swaying... Oh my gosh. Made sure that the kayak's swaying had steadied somewhat and attended to business. The thin gold stream glinted in the morning light as it dropped into infinity. The depths were black, purple, and inscrutable once again. My lower back hurt, and I remembered the kidney stone nightmare of the previous few days. That seemed like another life to me now, long ago and far away. Well, I thought, if there's another tiny stone being passed, I'm not going to catch it today. I was buttoning up and settling back into the cockpit, trying to stretch my aching legs without actually falling out, thinking about the impossibility of finding another Farcaster ring anywhere in this endless sky after that night of being blown off course, as if I had ever had a course, when I suddenly realized that I was not alone. Living things were rising from the depths and circling around me. At first I saw only one creature, and had no scale with which to judge the size of the visitor. The thing could have been a few centimeters across and only meters from my floating kayak, or many kilometers across and far, far away. Then the organism swam between a distant cloud pillar and a more distant cumulus tower, and I realized that kilometers was a more reasonable guess of size. As it came closer, I saw the myriad of smaller forms accompanying it through the morning sky. Before I attempt to describe the things, I have to say that little in the history of humankind's expansion in this arm of the galaxy had prepared us to describe large alien organisms. On the hundreds of worlds explored and colonized during and after the Hegira, most of the indigenous life discovered had been plants and a very few simple organisms, such as the radiant gossamers on Hyperion. The few large evolved animal forms, the lantern mouths on Mare Infinitus, say, or the zeppelins of Whirl, tended to be hunted to extinction. The more common result was a world filled with a few indigenous life forms and a myriad of human-adapted species. Humanity had terraformed all these worlds, bringing its bacteria and earthworms and fish and birds and land animals in raw DNA form, defrosting embryos in the early seed ships, building birthing factories in the later expansions. The result had been much as on Hyperion. Vital indigenous plants such as the Tesla trees and chalma and weirwood and some surviving local insects coexisting with thriving old earth transplants and bio-tailored adapts such as triaspen, everblues, oak trees, mallards, sharks, hummingbirds, and deer. We were not used to alien animals. And these were definitely alien animals rising to meet me. The largest one reminded me of a cuttlefish, again one of the old Earth's adapts, that thrived in the warm shallows of the Great South Sea on Hyperion. This creature was squid-like but almost transparent, its internal organs quite visible, although I admit that it was difficult to determine its exterior from its interior as it pulsed and throbbed and changed shape from second to second, almost like a starship morphing for battle. The thing had no head as such, not even a flattened squid-like extension that might be considered a head, but I could make out a variety of tentacles, although fronds or filaments might be a better word for the constantly swaying, retracting, extending, and quivering appendages. But these filaments were inside the pale, clear body as much as outside, and I was not sure if the creature's movement through the air was a result of the swimming motion or of the filaments, or because of gases expelled Okay, let's try this again. But these filaments were inside the pale, clear body as much as outside, and I was not sure if the creature's movement through the clear air was a result of the swimming motion of the filaments, or because of the gases expelled as the giant cuttlefish expanded and contracted. As far as I could recall from old books and Grandam's explanations, the Zeppelins on Whirl were much simpler in appearance. Blimp-shaped gas bags, mere Medusa-like cells to hold their mix of hydrogen and methane, storing and metabolizing helium in their crude lift sacks, giant jellyfish floating in the hydrogen-ammonia-methane atmosphere of Whirl. As best I could remember, the Zeppelins ate a sort of atmospheric phytoplankton that floated in the noxious atmosphere like so much airborne mana. There were no predators on Whirl, until humans arrived in their floating bathyscaphes to harvest the rarer gases. As the cuttlefish creature grew closer, I saw the complexity of its innards. Pale, pulsing outlines of organs and intestine-looking coils and what might be feeding filaments and tubes that might be for reproduction or elimination, and there were some appendages that might be sex organs or perhaps eyes. And all the while it folded in on itself, retracted its curling filaments, then pulsed forward, tentacles extended fully, like a squid swimming through clear water. It was 500 or 600 meters long. I began to notice the other things. Around the cuttlefish swarmed hundreds or thousands of golden, disc-shaped creatures, ranging in size from tiny ones perhaps as large as my hand, to others larger than the heavy river mantas used to pull barges on Hyperion's rivers. These things were also nearly transparent, although their insides were clouded by a sort of greenish glow that might have been an inert gas excited to luminescence by the animal's own bioelectrical field. These things swarmed around the cuttlefish, at times appearing to be swallowed or absorbed by some orifice or another, only to reappear outside again. I could not swear that I saw the cuttlefish eating any of the swarming discs, but at one point I thought that I could see a cloud of the green glowing things moving along the inside of the cuttlefish's gut, like ghostly platelets in a clear vein. The monster and its cloud of companions floated closer, rising until the sunlight passed through its body on its way to light my kayak and parasail. I revised its size upward. It must be at least a click long and a third that in width when it expanded to its widest. The living discs floated to each side of me now. I could see that they were spinning as well as curling like mantas. I tugged out the flechette pistol Alem had given me and clicked off its safety. If the monster attacked, I would fire half the magazine of slivers into its pale side, hoping that it was as thin as it was transparent. Maybe there was a chance that I could spill whatever lift gases allowed it to float in this band of oxygen atmosphere. At that moment, the thing's hydra-like filaments flashed out in all directions, some missing my parasail by mere meters, and I realized that I could never kill or sink the monster before it destroyed my sail with one thrash of one tentacle. I waited, half expecting to be pulled into the cuttlefish's maw, if it had a maw, at any second. Nothing happened. My kayak floated in the direction I thought of as westward, the parasail rising on thermals and descending on colder downdrafts, the clouds towering around me, and the cuttlefish and its companions, I thought of them as parasites for no good reason, stood off a few hundred meters to the north and 100 meters or so above me. I wondered if the green platelets drifting around me I wondered if the thing was following me out of curiosity or hunger. I wondered if the green platelets drifting around me might attack at any moment. Capable of doing nothing else, I laid the useless flechette pistol on my lap, nibbled on the last of my biscuits from my pack, and sipped from my water bottle. I had less than another day's supply of water. I cursed myself for not trying to catch rainwater during the night's terrible storm, although I had no idea if this world's water was potable. The long morning grew into a long afternoon. Several times the drifting parasail took me into a cloud tower, and I raised my face to the dripping fog, licking droplets from my lips and chin. The water tasted like water. Each time I emerged from the fog, I expected the cuttlefish to have departed, but each time it remained on station to my right and above me. Once, just after the halo that was the sun above had passed the zenith, the kayak was blown into a particularly rough patch of climbing cloud, and the parasail almost folded in the violent updraft. But it stabilized itself, and when I emerged from the cloud that time, I was some kilometers higher. The air was thinner and colder. The cuttlefish had followed me up. Perhaps it's not hungry yet. Perhaps it feeds after dark. I reassured myself with a series of these thoughts. I kept scanning the empty sky between clouds for another Farcaster ring, but none appeared. It seemed folly to expect to find one. The air currents blew me generally westward, but the vagaries of the jet stream sent me clicks north and south. How could I thread such a small needle after a day and night and day... How could I thread such a small needle after a day and night and day of blowing around like this? It did not seem likely. But still I searched the sky. In mid-afternoon I realized that there were other living things visible far below to the south. More cuttlefish moving about the base of an immense cloud tower, the sunlight piercing the depths enough to illuminate their clear bodies against the black of the broiling depths beneath them. There must be scores, no, hundreds, of the pulsing, swimming things along the base of that one cloud. I was too far away to make out the platelet parasites around them, but a sense of diffused light there, like dust floating, suggested their presence by the thousands or millions. I wondered if the monsters usually kept to the lower atmospheric levels, and this one, still keeping pace with me within feeding filament range, had ventured up out of curiosity. My muscles were cramping. I pulled myself out of the cockpit and tried stretching along the top of the kayak's hull, hanging on to the parasail risers to keep my balance. It was dangerous, but I had to stretch. I lay on my back and pedaled an imaginary bicycle with my raised legs. I did push-ups, clinging to the rim of the cockpit for balance. When I had worked most of the cramps out, I crawled back into the cockpit and half-dozed. Perhaps it is odd to admit, but my mind wandered all that afternoon, even while the alien cuttlefish swam alongside within swallowing range, and alien platelet creatures danced and hovered within meters of the kayak and parasail. The human mind gets used to strangeness very quickly if it does not exhibit interesting behavior. I began thinking about the past few days and the past months and the past years. I thought of Ania, of leaving her behind, and of all the other people I had left behind. A. Betic and the others at Taliesin West, the old poet on Hyperion, Demloa and Demria and their family on Vitus Grey Balianus B, Father Glaucus in the frozen air tunnels of Sol Draconi Septum, Kuchiat and Chiaku and Kuchtu and Chichtuku, and all the other Chitchatuk on that same world. Ania had been sure that Father Glaucus and our Chitchatuk friends had been murdered after we left that world, although she had never explained how she could know that. And I thought about others I had left behind, working my way back to my last sight of Grandam and the clan members waving as I left for Home Guard service many years ago. And always my thoughts returned to leaving Ania. I've left too many people, and let too many people do my work and fighting for me. From now on I will fight for myself. If I ever find the girl again, I will stay with Ania forever. The resolution burned like anger through me, fueled by the hopelessness of riding another hopelessness of... Oh, it should be finding. It says rinding. Some weird printing error or something. The resolution burned like anger through me, fueled by the hopelessness of finding another Farcaster ring in this endless cloudscape.
You know, the one who teaches? She has touched you?
The words were not carried by sound nor heard by my ears. Rather, they were like blows to the inside of my skull. I literally reeled, gripping the sides of the kayak to keep from falling out.
Have you been touched, changed, learning to see, hear, walk from the one who teaches?
Every word was a migraine blow. Each struck with the force of brain hemorrhage. The words were shouted inside my skull in my own voice. Perhaps I was going mad. Wiping away tears, I peered at the giant cuttlefish and its swarm of green platelet parasites. I peered at I just read that. The larger organism pulsed, contracted, extended coiling filaments, and swam through the chilly air. I could not believe that these words were coming from that creature. It was too biological. And I did not believe in telepathy. I looked at the swarming discs, but their behavior showed no more sense of higher consciousness than dust motes in a shaft of light, less than the synchronized shifting of a school of fish or the flocking of bats. Feeling foolish, I shouted, "Who are you? Who is speaking?" I squinted in preparation for the blast of words against my brain, but there was no response from the giant organism or its companions. "Who spoke?" I shouted into a rising wind. There was no answering sound except for the slap of the risers against the canvas of the parasail. The kayak slewed to the right, righted itself, and slewed again. I swiveled to my left, half expecting to see another cuttlefish monster attacking me, but instead saw something infinitely more malevolent approaching. While I had been focusing on the alien creature to the north, a billowing black cumulus had all but surrounded me to the south. Wind-tattered streamers of black whirled out from the heat-driven storm cloud and roiled under me like ebony rivers. I could see lightning flashing in the depths below and surging spheres of ball lightning being spat from the black column of storm. Closer, much closer, hanging from the river of black clouds flowing above me, curled a dozen or more tornadoes, their funnel clouds striking toward me like scorpion tails. Each funnel was the size of the cuttlefish monster or larger, vertical kilometers of whirling madness, and each was spawning its own cluster of smaller tornadoes. There was no way that my flimsy parasail could withstand even a close miss by one of these vortexes, and there was no way that the funnels were going to miss me. I stood up in the pitching, rolling cockpit, holding my place in the boat only by grasping a riser with my left hand. With my right hand I made a fist, raised it, and shook it toward the tornadoes, toward the roiling storm beyond them, and toward the invisible sky beyond. "Well, God damn you, then!" I shouted. My words were lost in the wind howl. My vest flapped around me. A gust nearly blew me into the maelstrom. Leaning far out over the hull of the kayak, bracing myself into the wind like a ski jumper I had seen once on the ice shelf, caught in a moment of mad, poised balance before the inevitable descent, I shook my fist again and screamed, "Do your worst, God damn you! I defy you, gods!" As if in answer, one of the tornado funnels came sidewinding closer, the lowest tip of its whirling cone stabbing downward as if seeking a hard surface to destroy. It missed me by a distance of hundreds of meters, but the vacuum of its passing whirled the kayak and parasail around like a toy boat in a draining bathtub. Relieved of the opposition of the wind, I fell forward onto the slippery kayak hull and would have slid into oblivion if my scrabbling hands had not found a riser to grip. My feet were fully out of the cockpit at that moment. There was a hailstorm traveling with the passing funnel. Ice pellets, some the size of my fist, smashed through the parasail, pounded the kayak with a noise like flechette clouds slamming home, and hit me in the leg, shoulder, and lower back. The pain almost made me release my grip. That mattered little, I realized as I clung to the pitching, dipping kayak, because the sail had been torn in 100 places. Only its canopy had saved me from being shot to bits by the hail, but now the delta-shaped foil had been riddled. It lost lift as suddenly as it had first gained it, and the kayak pitched forward toward the darkness so many thousands of clicks below. Tornadoes filled the sky around me. I gripped the now useless riser where it entered the battered hull and hung on, determined to complete that one act, hanging on, until the boat, furled sail, and I were all crushed by pressure or shredded by the winds. I realized that I was screaming again, but the sound was different in my ears. almost gleeful. I had fallen less than a kilometer, the kayak and me gaining speed far beyond Hyperion's or Old Earth's terminal velocity, when the cuttlefish, forgotten behind and above me, made its lunge. It must have moved with blinding speed, propelling itself through the air like a squid jetting after its prey. The first I knew that it was hungry and determined not to lose its dinner was when the long feeding tendrils surged around me like so many huge tentacles, coiling and probing and wrapping. If the thing had tugged me to an immediate stop at the speeds the boat and I were falling, both kayak and I would have been snapped into small pieces. But the cuttlefish fell with us, surrounding the boat, sail, risers, and me with the smallest of its tendrils, each still 2 to 5 meters thick, and then it braked itself against the fall, jetting ammonia-smelling gases like a dropship on final approach. Then it began ascending again, up toward the storm where tornadoes still raged, and the central stratocumulus rotated with its own black intensity. Only half conscious, I realized that the cuttlefish was flying into that roiling cloud, even as it reeled the bashed kayak and me toward an opening in its immense transparent body. Well, I thought groggily, I've found its mouth. Risers and shreds of parasail lay around me and over me like an oversized shroud. The kayak seemed to be draped in a drab bunting as the cuttlefish pulled us in closer. I tried to turn, thought of crawling back toward the cockpit and finding the flechette gun, of cutting my way out of the thing. The flechette gun was gone, of course, shaken out of the cockpit in all the violent tumbling and the fall. Also gone were the cockpit cushions and my backpack with the clothes, food, water, and flashlight laser. Everything was gone. I tried to chuckle, but the sound was not quite successful as the tendrils pulled the kayak and its clinging passenger the last 50 meters to the gaping orifice on the underside of the cuttlefish's body. I could see the internal organs more clearly now, pulsing and absorbing, moving in peristaltic waves, some of them filled with the green platelet creatures. As I was pulled closer, there came an almost overwhelming stench of cleaning fluid. Ammonia, I realized, that made my eyes water and throat burn. I thought of Ania. It was not a prolonged or eloquent thought, just a mental glimpse of how she had looked on her 16th birthday, all short hair, sweat, and sunburn from her desert meditations, and I formed the single message. Sorry, kiddo. I did my best to get to the ship and bring it to you. Sorry. Then the long feeding tendrils curled and folded and pulled the boat and me up into a lipless mouth that I realized must be 30 or 40 meters across. I thought of the fiberglass and ultra-nylon parasail fabric and the carbon fiber risers that were entering with me, and had time for a last thought. I hope some of this gives you a bellyache. And then I was pulled into the ammonia and fish smell, was vaguely aware that the air here in the creature's gut was not really breathable, decided to jump from the kayak rather than be digested, but lost consciousness before I could act or frame another coherent thought. Without my knowledge or observation, the cuttlefish continued to rise through cloud blacker than a moonless night, its lipless mouth closing and disappearing on its seamless flesh, the kayak and sail and me nothing more than a shadow in the fluid contents of its lower tract. And that is where we will call it for today. I have yet to find out what my schedule is for next week. When I know what it is, I will post it in the Discord, and we'll go from there accordingly.
Sunday is possible. I did not want to hit that button. It didn't break anything. We're good. Sunday's a distinct possibility. We'll find out as we get closer to it. Anyway, that is our chunk of the Rise of Endymion for today. And, yeah, stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other. And I'll see you all next time.